So with this module, we're making a big turn in the content we're covering in this semester. So up until now, we did the foundations of taxonomy and what species are and evolution, especially focused on natural selection, but also covering other things in speciation and a lot of time on phylogenetics. Now what we're going to do the rest of the semester is kind of put all this together and see how we can use that basic knowledge to understand the diversity of life, the biodiversity on this earth. And we're going to start at the coarsest level, both at the smallest scale in the structural hierarchy and at the highest level in the taxonomic hierarchy. And these are called the three domains, and we'll talk about them in a minute. But here you're going to see lots of phylogenies the rest of the semester. Okay, so let's start at the bottom of the structural hierarchy, not at the absolute bottom with molecules and atoms and that stuff, which we'll talk a bit about today. But let's start with cells. And that if you want to understand kind of what life is about, one important way to focus on that is with a cell. And we already have learned that cells are a fundamentally important basic unit of life. It's fundamentally through cells that all organisms basically at some level interact with their environment and feed and reproduce, even if not all cells are collectively involved in feeding and reproduction, but they are fundamentally important kind of structural, meaning it makes up the bodies, and function what the bodies are capable of doing units. And if you're alive, you are made up of one or more cells. Most life today is only one cell. They're single-celled. Think of bacteria. There's zillions of them. You'll find out how many in coming modules. But all life is made up of cells. And when we look at the world around us, there's some important cell terms that we need to know. And we're not going to go crazy here. You've learned a lot more terms probably in high school or other classes. If you go on as a major, you'll learn a lot more of these things when you get to cell biology or genetics or 1199 and 1198. But for now, these are the key terms I want you to know. So all cells are surrounded by a plasma membrane that is a really cool kind of set of molecules, really complicated set of molecules that surround the cell. And the membrane is basically the divider between the cell itself and the world around it. There could be other cells if you're a multicellular organism, or it could be a fluid or some other environment. Some other cells have cell walls and other complexities to them, but they all have a cell membrane. And then not all cells have organelles, but some cells do. Organelles, you'll remember, are kind of below the cellular level. So an organelle are all the little kinds of parts within this cell that are membrane bound as well. So they have their own kind of almost subcellular membrane. Um, and in a way, they're kind of miniature cells within a cell. And not all cells have organelles. There are three that I want you to know for this class. A nucleus, whose main job is focused on storing DNA. That's where the DNA is stored with its chromosomes and other stuff, and critically important in reproduction. So you can think of the organelle as a reproductive organelle. Um, and then two other ones that are more feeding related organelles, the mitochondrion. Usually there are multiple mitochondria, plural, and this is basically where sugar is converted to energy. And pretty much all cells with a nucleus will have mitochondria. ATP, the letters ATP, are the main energy molecule of life. All life uses ATP in some form for storing energy. It's basically like a molecule that, because of its phosphorus bonds, its long name is adenosine triphosphate. You'll learn all about it in other classes. But the phosphate bond stores a lot of energy. And so when you put this together, it stores energy. When you release the ATP, that energy gets released to do other things that life needs. And then if you're photosynthetic, you have an organelle called chloroplast. Now, this is an animal cell, so there are no chloroplasts. But if you're a plant cell or an algal cell, you could have chloroplasts that convert sunlight into sugar, and then from there, that sugar then gets moved to the mitochondrion where energy gets produced. So for this class, there are three, and often they're abbreviated N or NC or NU. for nucleus, the MT or MIT for mitochondrion, and then the CL or CHL for chloroplast. You can think of it as a reproductive organelle and two feeding organelles. And again, for this class, organismal biology, it all comes down to feeding and reproduction. If you don't have a nucleus, you typically don't have any other organelles. If you have a nucleus, you're typically going to have a lot of organelles. So some cells have organelles, some don't. Okay, and so in all of the grand scheme of biology, of life itself, there are two kinds of cells that we see, an enormous diversity within these basic categories. The one category is called prokaryotic cells, and we'll talk about the etymology of the name in a second. Typically, these are the cells that if you're bacteria, and I'm going to put this in quotation marks until we officially formally define what bacteria are, you might be surprised, but the things that most people call bacteria have this kind of cell. The cells make up the organism. So if you're this kind of a cell, the cell is the organism. So the cells are single-celled organisms or unicellular organisms. So this is the organism itself. It also is the cell. The cell is tiny, which means the organism is tiny. And here, oh, I should have written this down. This is called, let me get my little ruler here, is called a micron. Whoops, go back. Let me get this pen here so I can write this. And so this abbreviation here is micrometer, and we abbreviate micro with this Greek letter mu, which looks like a U with a little extra hook down here. And there are 1,000, okay, I'm not going to do so good here. 1,000 of these in 1 millimeter. And 1 millimeter is 1/10 of a centimeter. So basically, another way to look at this is there are 1,000,000 microns in a meter. Okay, so 1 micron to 5 microns. Our eyes, if you are really good with eyesight and patient, and somebody tells you it's there and you look for it, you might be able to see about 10 to 20 microns with your eyes. Most people don't have vision quite that good, but at this size, these are microscopic, which basically means invisible. Okay, they're there, but you're never going to see them unless you have a pretty sophisticated microscope. And even a normal microscope, like the kind you work with in the biolabs, typically aren't going to see these. You need a pretty sophisticated microscope to see these cells. And these cells are so tiny, 1 to 5 microns. A good rule of thumb is less than 10 microns or less than 0.1 millimeters. A good way to think of this is that they're so tiny that there's no organelles, but a good rule of thumb is that they're less than 10 microns. Okay, so lots of cool stuff going on. They have DNA, they still can reproduce, they still have the enzymes and proteins and things you need to do feeding and get energy and reproduce, but they don't do it in organelles. Okay, so they have everything, it's just not compartmentalized. And when we talked about mutations, the general thinking is because there's no nucleus here to surround the DNA, the mutation rates for these tends to be higher. They also reproduce insanely faster, and so they can evolve very, very quickly. Okay, then the other kind of cell are called eukaryotic cells. Let's do the etymology in a minute. These cells here, the cell itself is greater than 10 microns, so about 0.1 millimeter up to a millimeter in size. A millimeter you can absolutely see with your naked eye. 10 microns, again, if you know it's there, you might be able to tell something's there, but you're not going to see details. But this is getting to the point that it still, if you want to see details, need a microscope. It's still microscopic, but it's able to be perceived if you know it's there with the naked eye. The cells are bigger. The organisms that have these cells could be single-celled. So here's a protist. That the cell is the organism. And typically, in many cases, the organisms are multicellular, meaning that they have thousands or millions or billions of these cells all together working as a single organism. Often, if you're multicellular, probably with tissues and organ systems as well. Okay, if you're single-celled, obviously no organs or tissues because one cell can't make up a group of cells, which is what's needed for a tissue. By definition, these cells do have organelles. Almost always the nucleus. There's a very, very few kind of early cases that don't have a nucleus, but let's pretend they all have nuclei, one nucleus, two nuclei, and typically lots of other organelles, often mitochondria and if they're photosynthetic, typically chloroplasts. And so these organisms are sometimes called eukaryotes because of this cell. And these are what most people call the protists. Again, notice the quotation marks until we officially define that in next week's set of modules. Algae will also officially define that. And then the things that you call plants and fungi and animals. So you're a eukaryote. Now let's talk about the etymology. So karyo is the root in prokaryotic and eukaryotic. And karyo basically means kernel, like a kernel of corn. It's the same root, which if you think about it means seed. And so when people started working with microscopes, they quickly realized that the cells they were looking at in a microscope, some of them would have what appeared to be a little dot inside the cell. And they didn't know what that was, but they called it a seed, or what today we call the nucleus. The nucleus, often when you put stains into a cell, the DNA often will react with some of the common stains, and so the nucleus would stand out against the rest of the cell. And so that presence of what today we call nucleus, at that time they didn't really know what it was, but they called it a seed, is basically the remnant. A eukaryote, the reason for the name. So eukaryotic means true seeded. It has a nucleus. In a way, this group of life, we'll find out, is monophyletic. They're defined by the synapomorphy of a nucleus, plus some other stuff. Prokaryote basically means before a nucleus, before a seed, or there's no nucleus visible. Okay, so that's the etymology, the reference to the nucleus and really the organelles. Okay, and so there's tremendous diversity of eukaryotic cells, just like there are of prokaryotic cells. We're not going to get into the details in this class. In other classes, you'll clearly learn the difference between plant and animal cells and other kinds of cells. The key here is that if you're eukaryotic, whether you're an animal cell on the left or a plant cell on the right, there's a lot of organelles. There's always a big nucleus. There's always DNA in the nucleus. And typically there's mitochondria in both plant and animals, and chloroplasts if you're photosynthetic, plus a bunch of other important stuff like the endoplasmic reticulum. Notice this says ribosomes here. This is not an organelle. Ribosomes are little molecules floating in the cell but are involved in another organelle called the endoplasmic reticulum. And you'll learn about that likely in other classes. Okay, um, often textbooks show these side by side, and as somebody who really cares about body size, I study the evolution of body size a lot. Um, it's deceptive. You really want to compare them apples to apples, and here what you see is there's tremendous difference between prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. The cells of a prokaryote are tiny, 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 on average more than 10 times smaller in any dimension than eukaryotes. So it's not just simply nucleus or not, it's really tremendously fundamentally different. In fact, arguably you could argue that the mitochondria and the other organelles are more like, and actually in a lot of ways that we probably won't get into this semester, but you will hopefully in other classes, actually share enormous similarities with prokaryotic cells. Okay, so let's do a review, and then we'll call this module done. So which of the following traits is shared between prokaryotic and eukaryotic? And when we talked about Bloom's taxonomy, Bloom's taxonomy at a higher level is called analysis, where we're comparing, contrasting. It's a good question for that kind of a thing. It's a higher level thinking. So all of these are differences. Which of these is not the difference? Which is shared between a prokaryotic cell and a eukaryotic cell? Pause it and think about it. Okay, so the answer here is B. They both have DNA, they both can reproduce, they both have cell membranes that basically allow them to interact with their environment when molecules can pass that membrane either out from the cell or into. So they both have a functional cell with DNA. The difference is the size. So which one's bigger? Review. Prokaryotic or eukaryotic? Yep. Eukaryotes are bigger. Which ones have organelles? Yep, eukaryotes. And here I'm defining the nucleus as an organelle, but again, some people treat the nucleus separately. It's organelles and a nucleus, but really nucleus is a very important special organelle. And then which one can produce multicellular organisms? That's also going to be eukaryote. So eukaryotic cells allow organisms with those cells to do many, many more things in some ways, but not in others. And we'll talk about that coming up.